I'm Raashid AHAMED, meeting you all with Lankan Mentor. This video would be featuring about the part 2 of grade 11 second chapter, System Development Lifecycle. In the previous video, we discussed about how a system is developed, what a system is, and then what are the components of a system, what is an information system, the difference between manual and computer-based information systems, and then we went to system development life cycle. Today we'll be discussing about system development life cycle models, SDLC models. SDLC models are also called the way of approaching, right? The way of approaching the development of a system. Now, for software engineers, software developers who build the software, who build the system, these are some different ways of approaching that building method, building process, right? The building process can be done in different ways, right? So there are 6 steps that we discussed in the system development life cycle. First, you gather the requirement gathering. Then you go for design phase. Then you go for implementation, coding. Then you test the system. After that, you deploy the system. Finally, you maintain the system, right? So now, for these 6 steps, there are different models, different ways of approaching these 6 different steps. That is this SDLC model, right? So for your syllabus, we have to discuss 4 models. One is the Waterfall Model. Number 2, we have Iterative Incremental Model. Number 3, we have prototyping. Number 4, spiral. Right. Now, these are 4 system development lifecycle models that we have to discuss. Okay. Now we'll go through each and every one of these deeply so that we can get an idea of how these behave. Okay. First, we'll start with Waterfall Model. Now, as the name suggests, Waterfall Model is like a waterfall, right? Just like this. It comes down but never goes back. Now, in a waterfall, the water flows down, but the water never goes back in reverse, right? The water doesn't come back. The water always flows down. Just like that, in a waterfall model, you have to remember, if you pass each and every step in a waterfall model, there is no going back. You cannot go back a step in waterfall model. If you go back, there will be a great loss, right? It will cost you a lot of money and resources, right? So Waterfall model is just like this. First, you start with requirements, right? And then it goes to design, then implementation, then testing, then deployment, finally maintenance, right? Now this is how a waterfall model looks like, which means first you go with requirements and then you design it, implement it, test it, deploy it, maintain it. Now there is no going back. Why do you have to go back? Think of it like this. Now, if you have gathered the requirements according to this model, first we gather the requirements for the system to build. Now let's say a customer is coming to us, right? Let's say I am the software engineer here, right? So a customer, let's say you are the customer, you are coming to me and then you are saying these are my requirements, so I have to build a system for this and those stuff. Fine. So I gather those requirements and then we go for an analysis and then we go for design phase. We go for the design phase. But the other day, after about a week, when we have started designing, we have already started designing, right? Now the customer, you are calling me and saying, I have one more thing to tell you, I just forgot about it. Can you include this thing also in your requirements? This can happen, right? Because humans make mistakes. Humans can make errors. There is room for errors. So, when we are in the design phase, according to Waterfall model, we cannot go back to requirement gathering. We are only going to focus on what we gathered earlier. Right? What we gathered earlier. So, new requirements is not possible when we are in the design phase. Just like that, now let's say we were not in the design phase. We had designed it, implemented it, and we are testing now. In the testing phase, you are calling me and saying, I have some more thing to add in the software. I have something new to add in the system. So, what would be the situation now? Earlier, somewhat okay. If we were in the design phase, we can cut the cost and then we can put a new budget and then add it to the requirements. But think of this, we are in the testing phase and the customer is calling for a new thing to add in the software. We have already coded it, designed everything, it's finished. We are testing now. Now the customer is calling and saying, we have to add something like this. So think about the loss we are going to incur. See, you are in the testing phase. So the time, money and resources allocated for implementation, designing, gathering requirements, everything will be a loss if you go back to requirements. Right? So that is why we say Waterfall model is a model where you finish one step fully. Waterfall model is where you finish one particular step fully. If it is fully finished, then you go to the other step. And in the other step, if it is fully completed, you go to the other step, just like that. Right? So, you don't come back to another step in Waterfall model. Waterfall model, you can't come back to another step. Right? So, Waterfall model, as it goes one by one after the other, it is also called linear sequential model. Linear sequential model. This is another name for Waterfall model. Why is it called linear sequential? It goes in a sequence, linear, going down, right, in one line. So it is linear sequential model, right? So the advantages of Waterfall model is that it is very cost effective but not practical, right? Practically, Waterfall model is not possible. Waterfall model is good for theory only, for books, for writing only, right? Waterfall model is not good for practicing. Okay, so as a remedy to overcome the problems in Waterfall model, what are the problems? you can't go back another step, right? Once you finish a step, you can't go back to the step again. That is another problem in waterfall model, right? If you go back, the cost is high. The loss, whatever you lost, whatever the cost you are losing will be high, right? So these are some problems in the waterfall model. So these problems are solved through the iterative incremental model, right? We'll discuss that. Right. So second is iterative incremental model, right? We also call it iterative model, incremental model, anything, right? Now, this iterative incremental model has got its name because we develop the whole system in a repetition, in an iterative fashion, which means one by one. Now if we have a full system, a big software to develop, then we develop it in small parts, subsystems. The developing software, the whole software is divided into small components, and then we develop one small component in one cycle. In one turn, we develop one small component at a time. So, the advantage of the incremental model is we don't have to know all the requirements first. We don't need all the requirements at first. We can start with a few requirements and start to build the first component. In the next component, we can add some few more requirements and then start the new component. So just like that, small components, we build one particular component and then keep it by testing, and then we deploy it, right? We deploy the first component and then we start second component. After building the second component, we fix it with the first one. We deploy it with the first one, right? So it is becoming bigger now. And we build another small component and then test it and deploy it with the first two components. So now we have completed three components. Now we are building a fourth component, let's say. Now we build the fourth component and fix it again. So there are four components now. You see, we are building the whole system small by using small components, right? So that is iterative incremental model, right? So now in this iterative incremental model, you see the initial planning or initial requirement gathering is through this, right? After that, you plan the requirements, you gather the requirements, and then gathering means after planning, if there is any requirement according to the plan, if you need any other requirements, then you gather them, you do the analysis, and then you design the requirement. After that, you implement it, code the system, and then you test it. And evaluation, it is evaluation over here, not evolution. In your book, it is evolution. It should be evaluation. Evaluation means learning, studying that particular process, right? Evaluating it, and then you deploy it, right? You deploy. After that, you see, this part is this. Here, this line is this. So it comes like this. Then it goes out like this. Again, it's like this. It keeps on going, right? So this in this part, when you deploy it, again you start the new increment, next increment. You see, the next increment comes in planning, gathering, analysis, implementation, testing, evaluation, deployment. Again here, next increment. So it keeps on coming like that. So as each small component is done at a time, right, there is a possibility of adding new components, new requirements, right? You can add new requirements. So the problem in waterfall model is solved here. In waterfall model, once we go to the next step, we can't add new requirements, but here we can add new requirements. And another main thing is, using iterative incremental model, software engineers can learn, right? Software engineers, they can learn from the previous component, previous iteration. They can learn about the process, right? And the behavior and the developments that they can make in the upcoming components, right? So this is iterative incremental model, just like building a software using a different method, right? One method was waterfall method, this is incremental method, right? So incremental method means you build the whole system in small components, right? So it is easy to build, but it takes a lot of time and resources. Okay, right. And next we have prototyping. Okay, so the next thing is prototyping model. Prototyping model is like, as I told you earlier in the previous video, we discussed in the requirement gathering phase, there was a thing called prototyping. What is that? Prototyping means model, showing a model, right? So here also the same thing. Prototyping model means first you gather the requirements from the customer, right? You gather the requirements from the customer, then you design a model, just a dummy piece, right? A dummy software. It won't work, but the outer appearance will be there. You can just see what will be there in the software, just a model of the software. So what happens is, you gather the requirements, design a dummy, and then create the dummy, right? Create the dummy software and then show it to the customer evaluation. You show it to the customer. So if the customer is not satisfied, you don't go to the other step. You come down. You review the customer's feedback, what the customer has said. Okay, and then you update it and you design it again. And then you create the dummy again. You create a new model according to the customer's feedback. Then you ask the customer, is it okay? Do you like this model? Then the customer would say, okay. So if the customer is satisfied, you come down to what? Development. Development means implementing it fully, right? You implement the system because the customer is satisfied. So that is what we want. So you develop the system, test it, and then maintain it, right? Maintenance means deployment and maintenance both comes in this step. So prototyping means giving a model to the customer and checking if they like it. If they are satisfied, then we can go with the production of the software. So that is prototyping, right? And we have another model called spiral model, right? We'll look into that. Spiral model. Now, spiral model is somewhat similar to incremental model, but spiral model is used only for large scale projects, right? Large scale software development, because there is a lot of risk involved in large projects. So spiral model is also called a risk based production model, which means there is a risk analysis in spiral model, right? So spiral model can be given like this. You start with requirement gathering, right? And then you go for designing, and then you code it. You code the system and then test it, and you evaluate it. You evaluate the system, and then you go for the other iteration. the other iteration, which means gathering requirements, again designing, again coding and testing. Just like that, it goes on developing. So this is spiral model, right? So you gather requirements, you do the risk analysis, and then you do a prototype, and then you come to coding and testing, and then finally you evaluate that particular component. Just like that, it keeps on increasing, right? So in both incremental and spiral model, we have an advantage of adding new changes to the system. Now, as I told you earlier, if the customer or if the client calls us and asks for adding new requirements, the customer wants to add something new to the system, then you can add those new systems or new requirements using spiral model and incremental model, right? So not only these models, you have new models like there is something called Agile and Scrum. Scrum is also a part of Agile, and this is a development of Agile. Agile is the same, right? So DevOps, there was another called DevOps, and there's something called V model. So there's a lot of models, right? So for the moment, it is important for you to know about the differences between waterfall model and iterative incremental model. So I have discussed these things deeply. So if you can't remember, just go back, rewind the video, and then you can note them down. The problems and the advantages and disadvantages we have between waterfall model and iterative model. So let's look at the summary of the system development lifecycle model. First, you have requirements, requirement gathering. Second, you have designing, you have to design the system. Next, you have to implement it or build the software. Fourth, you have to test the system. Fifth, you have to deploy the system, and finally you have to maintain the system, right? Now I'm going to tell you an example from our real life so that you can remember it easily. Okay, now requirement designing implementation, this is a building process, right? Building process. Now let's take the example of building a house. Let's take the example of building a house from the beginning. Now let's say you want to build a house. You have a piece of land, right? You have to build a house. So before building a house, you have to have an idea, right? You have to gather the requirements. Okay, how many people are going to live in that house? How many stories will your house contain, right? Will it be a concrete house or will it be tiled with tiled roof? So likewise, you have to have some requirements. That is the requirement phase. You will have an idea of how your house will be. Next, you go to the designing phase. Designing is done by whom? The architect. You go to an architect and tell your requirements, and then he will design it. So you will get a plan. The architect will draw you a plan and then he will certify it. So with that plan, you can start building, implementing, right? You can implement that plan in your piece of land, right? So implementing the plan means you are building your house. So you start with the foundation and then you build those concrete blocks and all those walls, everything. You build it. You build the house fully and you have to test it. It's not you that is testing. The people who are building it, the contractors or the builders, they will test the house before giving it to you. They will test whether the roof has been paced properly, because if it rains, it should not leak, right? So they will test the roof, they will test the tiles, whether they are paced properly. They will walk upon the tiles and then see if there are any holes and stuff. They will look at the bathroom, is everything working fine, right? Because you don't want water to be blocked when you are in the bathroom, right? So just like that, every part of your house will be tested before giving it to the customer. After that, the customer will get the house deployment, which means the people will come and live in the house, right? So that is deployment. Deployment means giving the house to the customer. Okay, here is your product, here is your house, so people will come and live. So sometimes during maintenance, which means when people are living, there may be some problems arising. Okay, when there was a heavy rain, there was a leakage only in the kitchen, right? Only in the kitchen there was a leakage in the edge of the kitchen, let's say. So that is a problem that did not come in the testing phase. So again they will call the contractors, what is your house is leaking, what is this you have built, and so on. So they will come back and then they will fix that leak, right? They will fix that leak for you in your house. So just like that, in maintenance phase, people, when they are living, they will come up with some problems, so you have to solve them. So just like that. Now I told you how a house is built, from requirement to maintenance, right? Just like that, a software is built by taking the requirements, then designing it using flowcharts and all. After that, you go for coding. You code it using a computer language, and then you test it for any errors. If there are any errors, you will fix them, and then deployment. You release the software to the customer, you give it to the customer. So, and finally you maintain it. You have regular backups, and if there is any problem with the system, then you will fix those errors, right? So that is with the summary of system development life cycle. So I hope you have gotten the idea of how a software is developed and how it is deployed and maintained. So this is how large software companies are working, right? Even the software engineers, they do these steps. These are the methods. So even you can become a software developer, a software engineer, right? So these are the steps that come in a system development or a software development. Okay, so with that, again, I always say, whatever you understood, teach that to another person. Teach another person. So you will never forget, and you will never lose anything. You're going to gain. So help others, because we rise by helping others, right? So thank you for watching, and if you have any problems, just drop me a message so I can help you, and give me your feedback through the comment section so I can adjust my next videos according to that. And very important, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.